Every horror movie needs a good villain, but what about a villain nobody can see, hear, or more importantly, stop? What about a villain that has had a presence in literally every other horror movie ever made, but never like this? Back when James Wong introduced fans to a new type of horror with the release of the first Final Destination movie nearly 25 years ago, it represented a clever new spin on the teen horror subgenre. But it didn't exactly revive the format, as that honor had already gone to 1996's Scream, which went on to inspire a string of late 90s slasher films. Amidst the crowd, Final Destination found an inventive way to supply the blood-red meat of the slasher flick served with gory on-screen deaths without what was until then a key ingredient in this subgenre, a slasher. Rather than a human or even a humanoid killer, the antagonist in the Final Destination films is simply death itself. The first film saw a group of students traveling to France only to be kicked off of the plane after one student had a premonition about a plane crash. This sadly messed up the Invisible Reaper's initial design, and from then on, the entity began to hunt down all of the survivors in the most gruesome ways possible. Since the first Final Destination movie, we've seen a total of 5 installments in this highly profitable franchise, and even though these subsequent films really dipped in terms of quality, there are plenty of interesting stories to tell from behind the scenes of all these outlandish deaths. So we thought with another new Final Destination film on the way, we could go back in time to discuss our top behind-the-scenes facts about this slasher franchise without a slasher.
Before I begin, please consider hitting those like and subscribe buttons. Those 2 small clicks from you will help us tremendously in bringing you more of these marvelous videos. And now let's begin.
I won't let this happen. What are you, God now?
The first film was initially planned for an X-Files episode. From 1993 to 2001, agents Mulder and Scully from the FBI investigated dozens of bizarre phenomenons in order to discover the truth about aliens. But one of the episodes in The X-Files was originally going to be the plot of Final Destination. Many of you might not remember this, but the episode titled Flight 180 had the same basic concept of teens cheating death, but the main character in the episode would have been Scully's brother. The writer of this episode, Chris Carter, said he had to fit his idea into the mold of what would be expected from an X-Files episode, but the film was able to be much more detailed while discussing Death's role in the plane crash. According to series creator Jeffrey Reddick, the seeds of the original Final Destination were actually planted during a flight home to his hometown in Kentucky. During the flight, Reddick read an article about a woman whose life was supposedly saved when she switched flights after her mother had a bad feeling about the flight she was originally scheduled to take. Apparently, this news made Reddick have a creepy thought: what if this woman was supposed to die on that flight? Back then, Reddick was an aspiring screenwriter, and so, as a perfect setup for an X-Files episode, he wrote this thought up as Flight 180. In that script, Scully's brother Charles has a premonition that a plane he has just boarded is going to explode, and after he and a few other passengers get off, the flight does indeed crash. When the flight's defectors begin dying in what appear to be freak accidents, Scully and Mulder are called in to investigate. But there was originally a 58-page script PDF that never made it in front of X-Files producers. Later, in 1994, when Reddick was an executive assistant at New Line Cinema, his co-workers there suggested that the idea would work better as a feature, and so Reddick turned his TV script into a movie treatment that New Line finally bought in 1997. Well, the rest, as they say, is history. The first Final Destination was directed by James Wong, who also helped co-write the screenplay with Glenn Morgan and Jeffrey Reddick. The OG TV script written by Reddick was much more adult-oriented, but the influence of Scream on the horror landscape changed it all. So in Jeffrey Reddick's original TV script, everyone who deboards the plane and cheats death, only to die violently in the following days, is actually an adult. But by the time New Line bought Reddick's film treatment and hired him to write the screenplay, Scream had dramatically altered the horror movie landscape by reviving the teen horror genre that had once thrived in the 80s. Scream made the idea of teenagers hot again in horror films, so when New Line bought Reddick's treatment and asked him to write the movie version, they pushed for a younger cast, and that is how the story's main character became an 18-year-old Alex Henderson, who was later again renamed Alex Browning, a guy that would ultimately be played by Devon Sawa in 2000's Final Destination. Reddick's OG script for the first film was very, very dark. As you know, the Final Destination franchise is known and celebrated for its elaborate, gory deaths, which often have its characters impaled, decapitated, crushed, incinerated, run over, sliced up, riddled with nails, folded in half, crushed by logs, and so on. But even then, the deaths are just so cartoonish sometimes that they're not particularly disturbing. In fact, in terms of tone, the franchise has more in common with Looney Tunes than Longlegs. However, the characters in Jeffrey Reddick's original script suffered fates that weren't exactly meant to elicit horrified giggles. According to Reddick, since Death had messed up the first time, it couldn't just kill people. The first script basically exploited their biggest fears and even drove them to commit suicide. But to have a fine-tuned piggyback on the fans riding high on the scream effect, the studio chose to settle somewhere in between. Clive Barker was the first choice to direct the first Final Destination. In his interviews, Reddick had once revealed that the first filmmaker approached to make 2000's Final Destination was none other than Clive Barker. Unfortunately, Barker turned the opportunity down as he had essentially retired from directing any features at all, especially after clashing with studios over his two previous films, Nightbreed and Lord of Illusions. In his opinion, life was too short to deal with jerks. Well, he actually used a more colorful word instead of jerks, but anyways, that fully explained his decision to step back from filmmaking. So that's how the directing duties fell to James Wong, an X-Files writer and producer who had made his directorial debut in 1996 with the episode Musings of a Cigarette-Smoking Man. But all you really need to know is that Final Destination was his first feature, and he aced it. The studio was initially not on board with the idea of an invisible Grim Reaper to be the primary villain instead of an on-screen killer. One of the things that really sets the Final Destination franchise apart from other horror properties is the nature of the threat shown in all its films. I mean, for starters, there's just inherently no killer lurking in the woods or stalking teenagers in their dreams, which automatically translates to the idea that death can come by any means at any moment. That is the very reason the franchise has made us afraid of, well, pretty much everything. The idea of never knowing when the end is near for you made everyone's skin crawl, as even an acupuncture needle or a relaxing body spa can go wrong in a multitude of morbid ways, thus resulting in your rather graphic demise. This whole concept, where the films would invoke the fear of not just the unknown, but also the invisible and the uncertain, was actually introduced by Wong along with his frequent collaborator Glenn Morgan, who had also worked on The X-Files. The pair had co-written some of the series' most unsettling episodes, including the Season 1 skin-crawler Squeeze and Season 4's now infamous Home. Ironically, the novelty of their concept was a sticking point for New Line Cinema, as they were not able to get their head around the idea of a movie where you just didn't see the killer because a higher power like death was the killer. In fact, at one point, the studio wanted death to manifest itself in a physical, photographable way and suggested an elaborate melting face vision that would precede each character's death. But the effect was abandoned when it proved to be too expensive. But agreeing with what producer Craig Perry said back in 2020 in one of his interviews, I think if we had seen what death could look like, the franchise wouldn't even be famous enough to exist, and all these guys would be flipping burgers at In-N-Out. Many of the character names in the early Final Destination films were actually a tribute to all the legendary horror filmmakers. While most of the characters in the first movie get memorable death scenes, their character names are actually even more fascinating, as the majority of these names in the film pay tribute to iconic horror directors and actors. This has been happening throughout the franchise. Most of the Final Direction films have paid homage to several decades worth of horror directors, producers, and actors. For example, in the first installment, Devon Sawa's Alex Browning, whose premonition of a disaster sets the plot into motion, is named for Todd Browning, who directed Universal's seminal Dracula and MGM's often banned Freaks. Kristen Cloak's character, the ill-fated teacher Valerie Luton, is an even less subtle reference to Val Luton, the producer behind 1942's Cat People and the following year's I Walked with a Zombie. Amanda Detmer's Terry Chaney is a nod to actors Lon Chaney and Lon Chaney Jr., while Chad Donnella's Todd Wagner name checks both the aforementioned Todd Browning and the Wolfman director George Wagner. Not just that, Todd is also the German word for death, and that cannot just be a creepy coincidence. Moreover, there's also Sean William Scott's character, Billy Hitchcock, which we think is obvious enough. Other character names pay tribute to Nosferatu's director F.W. Murnau and his star Max Schreck. This naming scheme is also something that would be repeated in each of the Final Destination sequels, as all subsequent installments continued the trend with characters named after Roger Corman, John Carpenter, William Friedkin, George Romero, Tobe Hooper, and William Castle. Final Destination 2's opening sequence has become infamous since its release for being called the scene that traumatized an entire generation. We already agreed on how most of the on-screen deaths in the Final Destination films are just too cartoonish to be truly frightening or disturbing, because it is, and we say this rather thankfully, hard to imagine laser eye surgery ending in mutilation, violent death, and a dislodged eyeball. But still, the folks at LASIK.com did feel the need to explain that the chances of equipment malfunctioning in the way shown in the Final Destination movie are virtually non-existent. But the rare exception to the case is usually the disaster that sets each installment in motion. Those scenes tend to be grounded in relatable fears, because who hasn't felt at least a little nervous on a bumpy flight or while driving across a lengthy suspension bridge? But among everything else, there's still one Final Destination disaster that towers above the rest in our collective consciousness. Because if you Google, in particular, the scene that traumatized a generation, the search engine will helpfully direct you to the logging truck scene in Final Destination 2, which turns a stretch of highway into a hellscape of burning cars, mangled bodies, and the screams of dying motorists. According to Reddit, the Final Destination 2 cast of characters were originally meant to be trapped in a hotel fire during a spring break road trip. But the producer, Craig Perry, didn't believe the scenario was dramatic enough for his standards, and so he challenged Reddick to raise the stakes. That is how Reddick found the inspiration he was looking for during a trip, while he ended up stuck behind a logging truck and pulled over. When Reddick was parked on the side of the road, he called Perry and tried to run an idea by him. He wondered, what if a log truck was on the freeway and the chain broke? And immediately, just like that, Perry confirmed this concept for the film's opening. Since then, Reddick has cited this scene as his favorite opening in the franchise, and he loved how it made countless drivers terrified of timber lorries. In a way, he's not wrong. I mean, just think about how many lives he might have saved over the years by scaring people into not driving too close behind logging trucks. The poster for Final Destination 5 was banned in the UK. So in the year 2011, Warner Bros. Was forced to rethink its promotional campaign for the UK home media release, Final Destination 5. The studio had initially advertised the DVD release with a poster mounted in London buses and tube stations featuring a skull with iron rods protruding from its mouth and eye sockets. Let's just say that it triggered the British masses, as 13 people issued complaints to the nation's Advertising Standards Authority, including some who claimed the poster had made their young children visibly upset, which is basically code for "my child had a panic attack after seeing the poster and hasn't slept for days." However, Warner Bros. Argued that the poster accurately represented the movie, which is fair enough because Final Destination 5 does in fact feature a character being impaled in his cranial region by rebar. The studio also insisted that kids probably wouldn't even notice the giant mutilated skull because it wasn't rendered in bright colors, but the ASA found the studio's argument unconvincing and ruled that the poster had to go. The Final Destination franchise has a no dog killing policy. With more than 500 deaths across the first 5 installments, the Final Destination franchise might have the highest kill count for any horror series to date. But there is one demographic that can rest easy, at least for now. Apparently, director James Wong tried to get a dog killed on screen in the first installment. Clear had a dog and it was supposed to die, but after they tested the movie, everyone hated the scene so much that they were forced to reshoot a few scenes, which would make sure that the dog would continue living. James Wong had also mentioned in all his interviews about how reluctant he had always been about killing young children in the series, but the irony was that babies didn't count for him because in 2000's Final Destination, an infant is pointedly among the passengers killed when Flight 180 explodes. The directors of Final Destination Bloodlines got the job by faking decapitation during a Zoom pitch with studio executives. So in 2022, news broke that New Line Cinema had found its directors for Final Destination Bloodlines. which is the first new installment to enter its production phase since 2011's Final Destination 5. The studio had hired Zach Lipovsky and Adam B. Stein, who were best known for their well-received 2018 science fiction thriller, Freaks. Apparently, the duo was already on the edge of securing the Final Destination job when a Zoom stunt put them over the top. During a virtual pitch meeting, a fireplace behind Lipovsky and Stein suddenly became the cause of some genuine concern when it flared up and ignited the mantle out of nowhere. The duo managed to put the flames out, but in classic Final Destination fashion, the fire was a misdirection and the real threat came from above when a ceiling fan broke loose, crashed down, and beheaded one of the directors. It was, of course, an elaborate and rather successful audition staged by the filmmakers to demonstrate their enthusiasm for the project. That means we can hope for nothing but the best from them for the upcoming horror flick. Most of the premonitions in the franchise were based on real-life events. You might not be aware of this, but every Final Destination film is based on a horrifying premonition that eventually comes true. While the premonition and cheating death are, of course, fictionalized, several of the gruesome visions are actually based on actual events. Chris Carter debunked the theory that the original film was based on the TWA Flight 800 explosion, since he wrote his X-Files script in 1994, while the real-life tragedy didn't occur until 96. Apart from that, the highway accident in Final Destination 2 is thought to be based on a 125-car pileup in Ringgold, Georgia, while the racetrack massacre was based on the Le Mans motor racing disaster from the 50s. Lastly, the bridge scene in Final Destination 5 was likely partly inspired by the collapse of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. Tony Todd was an actual part of Final Destination 3. Remember Tony Todd, the guy who's most well known for his roles in Candyman, The Crow, and Night of the Living Dead? Well, Todd also appears in the Final Destination series as the character named Bloodworth, who's a mysterious mortician. Bloodworth also appeared in the first film to warn Alex and the others about cheating death, and he later again appeared in Final Destination 2 when Clear Rivers went to see him. While he doesn't appear again until Final Destination 5, his voice is actually in Final Destination 3, because right when Wendy and her friends walk into the ride Devil's Flight, it's actually his voice that can be heard as the devil. Two famous Hollywood stars auditioned to be a part of Final Destination 3. So Ashley Tisdale and Vanessa Hudgens are both very famous for their roles in High School Musical, but they also both auditioned for roles in Final Destination 3. Hudgens auditioned for Julie Christensen, who was the sister of Wendy, but the role of Julie ultimately went to Amanda Crew, who originally auditioned for Erin Ulmer. Similarly, Ashley Tisdale auditioned for Erin and lost out to Alex Johnson, but Tisdale must have really wanted a role in the franchise because she auditioned 2 more times for Nadia Monroy in The Final Destination and Candace Hooper in Final Destination 5. I guess Final Destination didn't go High School Musical after all.
Hey, Alex!
Devon Sawa could have returned again in Final Destination 2. I don't think there's anyone who would argue against the fact that Devon Sawa has always been the face of the Final Destination franchise. His character, Alex Browning, was the main character of the first film who saw Flight 180 explode before the plane actually took off. The alternate endings show Alex dying in an explosion after he tries to save Clear, and again by being decapitated by a helicopter blade. Sure, Alex survives the movie, but then he's said to be dead in Final Destination 2. It's widely believed that Sawa didn't return to the role because of a dispute with his contract. However, New Line has gone on the record saying that his death was a part of the story they were telling. That being said, getting hit in the head by a falling brick was definitely a pretty anticlimactic way to go. Officer Burke and Kimberly almost reprised their roles in Final Destination 3. I don't know if you guys recollect this, but Kimberly Corman and Officer Thomas Burke were the only 2 characters who were able to cheat Death's design in Final Destination 2. The last time we saw them, they were having a barbecue with the Gibbons family, but according to a choice on the Choose Their Fates special feature of Final Destination 3, Kimberly and Burke died after falling into a wood chipper. That being said, both characters almost appeared in the subway scene of Final Destination 3. In this installment, Kimberly was supposed to be Wendy's cousin, and Burke was also supposed to be on the train as well, so the death could kill all of the remaining survivors. Unfortunately, Cook and Landez had prior filming commitments, so they weren't able to appear in the film.
For a moment. Open big. Wider.
Tim was meant to be much younger. Tim Carpenter was one of the survivors of the Route 23 pileup. He was a 15-year-old boy who was on the way to the dentist with his mother prior to Kimberly stopping traffic. Tim eventually makes it to the dentist, where he almost chokes on a plastic fish. After leaving the office, Kimberly tries to warn them to stay back, but Tim runs up to scare some pigeons, causing them to fly away into the face of a construction worker. A heavy glass pane then drops on Tim, killing him instantly. While it was supposed to be a gruesome death scene, it could have been even worse. Tim was originally only supposed to be 9 years old. Executives at New Line thought this would have been too disturbing, so they decided to up his age and down the ante. The franchise was inspired by a real-life event. While we briefly touched base on this before, we should mention that this fact is a bit misleading because there has never been a real-life instance of someone surviving a plane crash due to a premonition, only to then be hunted down by an unseen spirit and brutally bumped off. At least, not yet anyway. Reddick has always spoken very freely about how he got the idea for the story, and whilst a lot of it came from his own sick, twisted imagination, some elements of the narrative actually did play out in the real world. Like we mentioned before, he came across this story about a woman who was on vacation in Hawaii, and her mom called her and asked her not to take the flight tomorrow as she had a really bad feeling about it. So this lady actually switched flights, and the plane that she would have been on did crash. Now, that is when Reddick thought, what if she was supposed to die on that flight? Well, it's definitely not a pleasant thought to have. It did give us a nerve-wracking horror franchise. So who knows? Maybe there's someone out there with psychic powers who genuinely did save her daughter from dying in a fireball. Or most likely, this woman just got very, very lucky. The plane set of the first Final Destination took 2 months to build. We all know that the inciting incident of Final Destination is, of course, the crash of Flight 180. After Alex and his friends are ushered off the plane, it takes off, but only lasts a few minutes in the air before something goes horribly wrong as the flight malfunctions, leading to a section of the plane being ripped off before it explodes in mid-air, killing everyone on board. Now, in order to achieve the spectacular opening set piece of Alex's premonition, the Final Destination crew had to put in some serious work, as construction of the interior of Flight 180 took 2 whole months to complete. The whole thing was on a gimbal, which meant that it could be rotated up to 45 degrees side to side and 60 degrees front to back. This was done to make everything look as real as possible and to elicit genuine reactions from the extras involved. Devon Sawa, who played Alex, said the screams that made it into the movie were actually real, as the cast aboard the plane were thrown around whilst being filmed. So those poor people probably thought they were really about to die. The first movie used original stock footage from the real news channels. In the wake of the Flight 180 disaster within the film, news stations from across the country descended to tell the story of what happened. So, rather than spending time and money filming their own fake news coverage, the production team decided to borrow from an actual aviation accident, and that too from one with quite the interesting history. TWA Flight 800 was a plane that took off from John F. Kennedy International Airport in 1996. It was also headed to Paris, albeit as part of a longer trip to Rome, and it too blew up shortly after takeoff, with all 230 passengers and crew losing their lives. This tragedy became the 3rd deadliest aviation disaster in U.S. history and was reported heavily on in the press, particularly as there were concerns that a terrorist plot had been behind it. With an abundance of footage available from this crash, the Final Destination team borrowed news clips of Flight 800 and put it into their movie. Since then, Jeffrey Reddick has said numerous times that this had no influence on his script, but even he can't deny the strange similarities between his imaginary crash and this terrifyingly real one. The train scene in Final Destination was really difficult to film. Remember that scene from the first film where it becomes abundantly clear to the survivors that death is coming for them, and one of them decides to rob the ghoulish force of the privilege of taking his life? Well, Carter, a brutish jock who begins the movie as Alex's enemy, parks his car on a set of train tracks to escape the invisible Grim Reaper's relentless pursuit. When Alex, Clear, and Billy finally catch up to him, they managed to persuade him to keep on living, but there was just one problem, because Carter was now stuck in the car, which was in turn stuck on the railway tracks, and really, just what are the odds of that? Even though Alex managed to rescue his former enemy before the train crashed into him, behind the scenes, the crew went to great lengths to keep everyone involved in this scene safe. The stunt, overseen by SFX supervisor Terry Sonderhoff, was achieved by cutting the car in half before shooting began. Sonderhoff and his team had to be incredibly careful that no sheet metal was left in the vehicle, just in case it flew off during the crash and injured somebody nearby. Of course, the great irony here is that that is exactly how Billy dies, mere moments after the train hits the car. Devon Sawa fell asleep on set. You think it would be impossible to take a nap during a movie featuring plane crashes, house explosions, and all-around murder and mayhem, but its ambitious lead actors somehow still found a way. During the opening scene, prior to the teens arriving at the airport, Alex is sleeping before he gets woken up to set off and board the flight. Now, of course, Devon Sawa was asked to pretend to be asleep in order for the crew to film this scene, but the guy was just so tired that he accidentally dozed off for real. And amidst all of that, Devon actually managed to sleep for 4 hours, which is clearly a talent most people would kill for. In a sweet gesture, the crew suspended filming while Sawa caught up on his sleep, letting the actor rest before picking up the scene. In his defense, the guy was pulling double duty, working on a film called The Guilty at the same time, so everyone clearly thought he deserved the break. That's nice and all, but just imagine how much those 4 hours must have cost. This may have been the most expensive nap in human history. The first movie had an iconic deleted scene that was exclusively reserved for the DVD release. One of the greatest things about DVDs was the plenty of space it had for special features, which also included deleted scenes. Now, editors didn't have to worry about chucking out hours of good material, as they could just bung it on the DVD release and go home happy. And this is precisely what happened when Final Destination got its home release, as fans were treated to a number of scenes that could have made the final cut, including a certain revelation about Clear Rivers. Played by Ali Larter, Clear is one of the rare survivors who made it right to the end of the movie, although it soon becomes clear that death was not through with her. In one deleted scene found on the DVD release, Clear discovered that she was pregnant and later gave birth to a bouncy baby boy, and because of the rules of the Grim Reaper, the creation of new life cancels out Clear's debt, which she is very ecstatic about. Although we were made to believe that there was a chance that Death would probably still find a way to claim her, as the entity didn't exactly like to play fair. But anyways, Clear names the baby Alex, as in this new version of the movie, he died saving her from some electrical wires. The first movie hid a rather cool Easter egg. So if you were able to get through Final Destination without being distracted by all the blood and bits of people's heads flying around, you might have been able to spot several references to all the famous people who were also taken before their time. The movie is littered with references to political figures who were assassinated, and with the fact that the doomed flight leaves from John F. Kennedy Airport. One of Ms. Newton's coffee cups is from Mr. Abraham High, which is a reference to Abraham Lincoln, who was murdered by John Wilkes Booth in 1865. And finally, the license plate on the car that Carter nearly gets smushed in contains the letters RFK, which are the initials of Robert Francis Kennedy, JFK's younger brother, who was also assassinated whilst running for president in 1968. This sort of attention to detail is exactly what film buffs go nuts for, as these are all subtle clues that don't distract from the story, but still make it so much better when you know exactly what you're looking for. And while we're on the topic of dead celebrities, the film also features 6 songs by John Denver, who died in a plane crash in 1997. Spider-Man stars could have been a part of the franchise. Had things gone a little differently, Final Destination might be remembered very differently today. During the casting process for the film, several names were flung around for the roles of Alex and Clear. Well, 2 of those names were Tobey Maguire and Kirsten Dunst, but this was still a couple of years before they would star as Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man. Now, Maguire had made a few appearances in big movies like Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas and The Ice Storm by this point, while Dunst had been a child star in the likes of Interview with a Vampire and Jumanji, but they had never really acted together. I mean, sure, chances are, had they both been involved with this project, they may not have taken on the roles that would define them to an entire generation of superhero fans. Whilst it would have been great to see these two in a radically different scenario, I guess we'll never know how a Final Destination starring Maguire and Dunst would have looked, as both actors turned down the parts New Line Cinema offered. Maybe they had an alarming premonition about it, or maybe they just got better offers elsewhere. The scene that traumatized an entire generation was filmed with real wooden logs. You remember that log scene we talked about? Well, during the filming of the second movie, real logs were tested for the highway pileup scene. However, since the real logs didn't bounce enough, the crew eventually had to switch to using CGI because shooting a horrifyingly dramatic scene like that in real life is actually life-threatening. Fan theories believe that the entity, Death, was actually shown in the film. Okay, so a lot of fans believe that William Bloodworth is the very personification of Death, or a major representative for it, because he seemed to know just so much about the mysterious deaths caused by this invisible supernatural force. However, this has been confirmed as false by the producers and actor Tony Todd himself. Maybe it was just a speculative loophole with a lot of potential. Final Destination 3's roller coaster drama. So, the main cast of Final Destination 3 had to ride the roller coaster exactly 26 times in a single night in order to film the Devil's Flight scene. During the shoot, they even placed bets on who would throw up first, with actor Texas Battle getting the most votes. The scene was definitely scary, and I personally haven't gotten on a roller coaster since, but it's cool that at least the actors made the most fun and memorable experience they could out of it. The hardware store was very real in Final Destination 3. Remember the hardware store scenes in Final Destination 3? Well, they were all filmed in a very real store. Apparently, the crew was only allowed to shoot after business hours and had to return everything to its exact place when they finished. Unfortunately, because of this, the team constantly had to restock shelves during filming. On top of that, they also had to turn items around in order to hide brand names, place objects in front of products, or cover labels with others since the store didn't want its brand associated with a gory teen horror film. Devon Sawa was the last to be cast in the film. While Devon Sawa has always been considered the real icon of the franchise, he was actually the last person to be cast in the film. In fact, he first read the script on a plane and became extremely paranoid as he was glancing out the window to check on the plane's engine while he read. Moreover, James Wong and Glenn Morgan weren't really sure about casting Sawa until they watched Idle Hands and fell in love with his performance. John Denver's haunting presence in Final Destination. If you remember, Rocky Mountain High by John Denver was featured rather prominently throughout the film, especially in Valerie Luton's death scene. It's also performed by a busker in French in a scene which was supposed to be taking place in Paris. John Denver's father was apparently an Air Force pilot, and John was a hobbyist who had his pilot's license and frequently flew planes. But because he pleaded guilty for driving under the influence of alcohol in 1993 and crashed his vehicle into a tree in 94 in a suspected drunk driving accident, plus the fact that he didn't maintain sobriety after those events, the FAA ruled in 1995 that John Denver was not allowed to pilot a plane ever again. Unfortunately, he died in a plane crash in 1997 while flying alone. While he was the only victim, he had no alcohol in his system. Many don't know this, but John had previously been in a plane accident in 1989, but he survived it and walked away unharmed. The logging truck accident manifested in real life. Back in 2019, an accident happened where a man driving behind a logging truck had a near miss with death. The driver rear-ended the logging truck and the logs were thrown through the windshield into the man's car. Luckily, he had bent down to retrieve something, or he would have definitely been impaled by the logs. While this man's name was never released, rescue workers had to cut through 30 to 40 logs before they reached the man, who survived with only minor injuries. If that's not disturbing, we don't know what is. The McKinley Speedway accident in Final Destination 4 was inspired by a real-life incident. So the film's McKinley Speedway accident was very similar to a real-life occurrence. The 1955 Le Mans disaster was a 24-hour endurance race where a multi-car collision launched an engine block, hood, and some other wreckage into a packed crowd of spectators, killing an estimated 84 people in total. The deaths were very, very grotesque, as it included spectators being cut in half by the flying hood like a guillotine. Not just that, the engine block crushed a swath through the crowd, followed by a massive explosion that caused a horrific fire to add to the death toll. Final Destination 4 had multiple alternate endings. As with all the previous installments of the franchise, there are also many unused endings in Final Destination 4. In one of these endings, Nick gets Laurie out of the cinema before the explosion kills Janet and the other attendants, but they unfortunately get stuck on the escalator. Laurie then gets caught in the mechanism and is ground to death. As Nick watches in horror, blood splatters against the screen and the movie ends, without the revelation that this was a premonition and Nick had another shot to save Laurie. However, in the second ending, Nick catches up with Laurie and Janet before they enter the cinema and tries to convince them that death is still not done with them. The girls seem incredulous, so Nick goes to the construction area where the fire is already raging, grabs a gas cylinder, and dives to his death out of the window. As he lands on a car, the subsequent explosion causes them all to be evacuated in time before the explosion goes off. And as Janet consoles Laurie by saying that Nick saved a lot of people, Laurie says that the chain has finally been broken. But as she says that, a large chain falls down from the crane above them, and before they can respond, both are crushed by the AC unit that was being held over their heads by the crane. If that's not ironic, we don't know what is. The mystery behind the mechanism of Hunt's death was explained in a deleted scene. In Final Destination 4, Hunt's death is caused by him getting stuck in the pool drain, which immediately disembowels him as the suction keeps building up. Now, why the drain pressure kept increasing wasn't explained in the movie, but a deleted scene showed that the golfer whose golf ball hit Hunt's glass had forgotten to properly park his golf cart. So, in typical Final Destination fashion, the cart subsequently rolls downhill, smashes a street lantern, which then hits the breaker box connected to the drain, causing it to overload and start pumping harder, thus leading to Hunt's death. Moreover, Hunt's death is very similar to one from Chuck Palahniuk's short story Guts, which is about a boy whose intestines are sucked out by a pool filter's inlet pump when he sits on it. Apart from that, it's also similar to one real-life incident from 2007 when a young girl met the same fate and died later in 2008, suffering complications after having her bowel, liver, and pancreas transplanted. Final Destination 5 was actually a prequel, not a sequel. Instead of what many of you might believe, this film isn't a sequel, but it's actually a prequel to the first film in the series, the OG Final Destination from the year 2000. This was revealed at the end of the film when Sam and Molly board Flight 180 and witness Alex Browning, along with some of his classmates, being removed from the airplane. According to writer Eric Heiser, the idea to make this installment a prequel came from the series producer Craig Perry, but the inspiration for the eye laser surgery scene came from Heiser himself after his wife had undergone such a treatment which scared the hell out of him. The Blu-ray release of Final Destination 5 has 2 alternate death scenes. Like all of its predecessors, Final Destination 5 also filmed alternate death scenes. In the first alternate death, at the massage parlor, Isaac doesn't die because his head is smashed by the Buddha statue, but because he's standing in the puddle of liquid and is then engulfed in flames when it ignites. And lastly, in another alternate death scene, instead of having just one eye burned, both of Olivia's eyes are burned during the laser eye surgery, although she still falls to her death in this version of the film. Marvelous verdict! So that's our list of a few of the very interesting facts about the Final Destination franchise. Now, are you guys looking forward to Final Destination 6 Bloodlines as much as we are? Let us know about your thoughts and opinions in the comments section down below. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Otherwise, thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and have a marvelous day.